Our speaker for the second of this afternoon's invited talks is Professor Amanda Randles, who is the Alfred Winborn Mordecai and Victoria Stover Mordecai Associate Professor of Biomedical Sciences and Biomedical Engineering at Duke University. Randles' research brings together high-performance computing, machine learning, and physics-based modeling with a focus on diagnosing and treating diseases ranging from cardiovascular issues to cancer. Her professional accomplishments have won her a long list of awards from the NIH, IEEE, NSF, and ACM. She was also named in the World Economic Forum Young Scientist list and in MIT Technology Review's Top 35 Innovators Under 35. Randles is a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. She earned her doctorate in applied physics from Harvard University with prior master's and bachelor's degrees from Harvard and Duke University, respectively. Before her doctoral studies, she worked as a software engineer at IBM on the Blue Gene supercomputing team. Her contributions to the scientific literature include 80 peer-reviewed papers. Her inventions have been granted more than 100 US patents, with an additional 100 pending patent applications. She will talk today about unlocking potential, the role of HPC in computational medicine. Amanda.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks so much for having me. When they first reached out and asked if I'd give this talk, I was incredibly humbled and honored and excited to give a talk here. I don't know about you guys, but supercomputing is definitely my favorite conference to come to. I think this is a really unique community, and I have really cherished being a part of it, and I think this community has really impacted my career at every stage as I've gone along. And I'm very excited that we have 14,000 people in town that are all passionate about high-performance computing. That's pretty amazing. And what I want to talk about is really how this community has really helped me in terms of like, they've supported me, you've all mentored me. I found the talks here to be a huge inspiration and really affected the direction of my research, and that's what I want to talk about today. What we're focusing on in our lab and what we're working on towards trying to marry everything that we're having advances on in this area in high performance computing and how that's coming together with medical technology to really improve our ability to find, to track human disease, and ultimately to improve our treatment of human disease. So I'm going to start by just level setting and trying to explain what I mean when I'm saying we're trying to build towards a virtual human. We're looking to trying to make a digital twin and kind of understand where are we coming from and what do we really mean by digital twin. We've seen this a lot in the last few decades where it's been adopted in industries like in aerospace and civil. We see a lot of virtual representations of physical assets that are being used to give us a sense of how those assets are advancing. So we have a virtual representation of, for example, a jet engine like you're seeing here. That jet engine, we can put it through a simulator that's going to tell us, what the workload is that the jet engine is going to see, how it's advancing in time, what is it like, what kind of stresses is it undergoing? But what's key and what the real advantage has been recently is the connection with different sensors. And we're getting real-time, continuous sensors that are allowing us to move it from being just a generic jet engine and trying to see what's going to happen to really having a digital twin of that specific jet engine that is informed by these sensors telling you in a dynamic way how it is evolving and what its state is. We see this in bridges. We see this for in virtual structural setups. We're creating these personalized dynamic models that are evolving in time with these representations. This tight coupling between these real-time sensors is allowing us to get these personalized models so we can identify if the engine needs to come in early for maintenance, or if you're trying to determine, I'm going to go on a flight, we need an engine, we need a plane that's going to be ready for a long flight that's going to be at high speed. Is this particular engine up for it? Is it going to be able to handle it? And can we take this, simulate the kind of event that we're trying to go forward with, and then see if that engine is prepared. Now we want to move that move it into the health space as well. And can we go back one slide? So in the same way that we've seen a lot of sensors moving forward for digital assets like bridges and jet engines, we're seeing a huge revolution in what we're getting in the healthcare space. So how many people here are wearing Fitbits, Apple Watches? Who has a smartwatch? Pretty much everybody has something. Maybe trying, is there anyone in the room who has held out and does not have a smartphone? I feel like there might be a chance in this community that we'd have one or two. Right now, we're really changing the way that we're monitoring people, the way that we're getting this data. We are getting real-time information that's continuously and automatically measured about the patient's state. So we know your blood pressure, we know your heart rate. We are able to get this information showing how the patient is changing when they're not in the doctor's office. And that's huge. It's really changing how we're able to get care and what the doctor can see. One of the ways I've been thinking about this is, it's very similar to what we see a lot this week at the conference of when you're trying to do a live demo. And it's kind of the opposite of doing a live demo. I feel like everything works perfectly when you're doing a live demo, and then when you're preparing for it, and then you go in and you do the demo, and everything breaks and everything goes wrong, which I'm sure hopefully didn't happen to anyone this week, but maybe you've run into this. You see the opposite happening when you go to the doctor's office a lot of times. You may be very winded when you're going upstairs. You may be getting a lot of migraines or having issues. By the time you finally get into the doctor's office, you're in front of the doctor and they're taking measurements, the symptoms aren't there, or you're not able to present, you're not seeing it, and they're really not able to understand what's happening to you in your daily life as you're going through these activities. And the measurements they can get are really through simulated exercise or whatever they can measure in the doctor's office sitting in that chair. By having this kinds of data with these wearables, we're actually able to give the doctor a better picture of what your physiological state is over time and at different stages. So our goal is to integrate this data with physical models, with advances in machine learning, with advances in AI, and see if we're able to create a digital twin that will help inform patient care and improve outcomes for these patients. So how do we actually go about doing this? Our challenge is really to bring in all of the data that we're getting from devices like wearable devices, like smartphones, all of this information, and pair it both with the AI to classify and analyze the data, but also bring in the predictive physiological models. We have a huge history here, especially in this community, of building these physics-based representations of what's happening in the system, and we need to be able to pair these with the data that we're getting from wearable devices and other such information. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit and focus in this talk specifically on the human circulatory system. So really in this case, just that first step of how do we, the long-term grand challenge would be it's great if we could create a virtual human. Let's take that first baby step and try to get just a digital twin of the human circulatory system. If we're focused on the circulatory system, in this talk I'll go over two basic examples. So we'll look at cardiovascular disease, and then we'll spend a little time looking at how we can use that for cancer. Just to give some information about what do we really need if we want to build that vascular digital twin, the geometry is key. So a lot of the advances we've seen in the last few decades have really been guided by we needed the high enough resolution imaging so that you can get a 3D anatomy that's representing that geometry. That's a critical first component. If you have the best simulation possible and the most accurate simulation, the biggest supercomputer, but you have the wrong geometry, it's not going to help. So we're really tied to creating these, making this patient specific, making it personalized, and how do we get that information from medical images, segment that data, and create that 3D patient-specific geometry. Then we need the high-resolution data. We need these physics-based simulations that are going to give you insight into the mechanisms driving the disease progression. We want to understand why it's localizing where it is, how it's progressing, and these physics-based models are giving you that kind of information. Now we have this ability to have the dynamic continuous tracking from these wearable devices. And the video you saw on the side, depending on the question you're looking at, we may need to understand the cellular interaction. So if we're looking at a question like cancer cell transport through the body, trying to understand why it's going to metastasize at different locations, we need to be able to capture information down to the cellular scale. And this brings in a lot of challenges that everyone in this conference and all the different types of talks you're going to are really feeding in. Whether you're interested in the medical area or not, we need your help and we need the area in, how do we visualize this data better? How do we move it onto the system better? How do we store the data? How do we interact with it? There are questions in virtual reality. It is, a very interdisciplinary, complex challenge, and we need people from all over the space to be addressing it. And I think one thing I want to point out here also, I think we're a little bit skewed when we watch things like sci-fi movies, and it gives you the idea that we're already there. And it makes you think, we could have a digital twin. We're very, very close. You go watch all of these images. And I wanted to kind of go back and show you where we've been in the last 10 years and really where things are. And at supercomputing specifically, we've really pushed the envelope of what you can model and where you can be at from the blood flow side. I like pointing this work out. This is, I think some of the authors may even be in the audience. This is fantastic work coming out of mainly Georgia Tech. The interesting piece here is they were able, and this is only in 2010, which isn't really that long ago, they were able to move the needle where they were able to simulate about 50 microliters of blood. The key point here is 1 microliter is about 1 drop of blood. The human body has about 5 liters of blood in the entire body. So it kind of gives you a sense of how far we are from trying to have an entire virtual human, when this is where we were in about 2010. And when they did this, they had moved the needle at that stage orders of magnitude to number of cells that they were able to simulate beyond what had ever been simulated before. So this was truly a landmark paper, moved things along extremely far, but we're still at only a couple drops of blood. We move on in the next few years, and this is why this has been a key part of Gordon Bell papers, and using the Gordon Bell just to kind of show how the mark has been moved in the last decade or so. We've seen in 2010, there was also the first coronary getting the entire cardiac cycle, so getting 1 heartbeat of data. In 2011, that was moved on to the GPUs and even pushed even faster. There was Cardiax's work that was fantastic in 2011 that actually spanned up from the centimeter scale, showing the need for multi-scale modeling all the way down to the sub-micron level. There's the work in 2015 where you're looking at the lab on the chip, really increasing the number of cells that are able to be simulated in a complex geometry. And then in 2015, we were pushing it to the full-scale body. But as you're looking at this model, and I'll show in a second, it is only a fluid-based simulation where we're able to get for the first time on the order of the full body, but it's still for only a few heartbeats and not including cells at that stage. I wanted to show this video, and this is what we showed in our work in 2010. This is from a code called MUFI, showing the blood flow simulation. The useful part here is, one, it gives you an intuition of what do I actually mean by these physics-based models? What am I trying to get you to picture and see? When we're thinking of these digital twins, we have these red blood cells that are interacting, and this kind of gives you a sense of why this is so computationally intense, why this is such a big part of this supercomputing, why we see this in these types of models in the Gordon Bell competitions so often. This model just in 2010 had about, I think it was like 300,000 different red blood cells. They're interacting with each other, they're interacting with the fluid. The interesting part here is it took about 6 hours on the entire Mira system at Argonne at the time just to model 1 single heartbeat. So if we're trying to move to the point where we want to capture flow over weeks or months, it's going to be incredibly computationally intense, even if we have much faster computers that we have today. In 2015, we were able to move from just the heart to the scale of the full body, which at least increased the amount of spatial domain we were able to capture. And now we have these models, and I want to touch on how we're actually going to be applying them in the cardiovascular space. So currently, the standard of care, cardiovascular disease is still one of the leading causes of death in the United States. If a patient has chest pain, they will go to the ER, go to the hospital, and then an invasive guide wire will be used to determine if they need to have intervention or not, and determine the severity of that intervention. We know that blood flow plays a key role in the advance of cardiovascular disease. We know that the location of plaque, the likelihood of plaque development, the advancement of that development, and can we go back one slide? The likelihood of that development is strongly influenced by fluid dynamic forces, the blood pressure, your shear stress on the walls, and we know that this evolves over time. So it's not just a single heartbeat, it's minutes to months to hours, or to years. And we want to get digital twins that are actually going to be able to capture this across these length scales. So kind of just pausing and trying to build an intuition, let's just look at an initial short term. So we have a lot of guidelines that are based on aggregate population data about how often and how long you should be running. But what about identifying what's going to make the biggest bang for your buck and the tangible difference for that specific patient? What if we had a what if we had a digital twin that would be able to help us identify if you know, I'm going to go try to run for 45 minutes, should I be focusing on speed? Should I be focusing on endurance? Or what would be best for me at this point in time? It would be great if you had a digital twin that knew how much sleep you got the night before, how tired you are, how much caffeine you've had, what your exact physiological state is, could go ahead and try intervals, a steady state run, a sprint, and then come back and tell you, this is what you're going to get your best specific bang for your buck if you go and do 35 minutes of steady state run today. And it can help you optimize what's going to happen for that specific patient and that specific physiological condition. What we really want to do is start looking at longer time frames, though. So one example here that comes up is when we're trying to optimize the outcome for a patient who has had a stent placed. So despite immense improvements in device design, patient monitoring, many patients still have stent failure, or they have a recurrence of that blockage within maybe 9 to 10 months of a stent being placed. We know that blood flow is directly going to impact the likelihood of that blockage. And what we want to be able to do is set up a digital twin that would allow us to virtually place these stents of different lengths, different material properties, different strut designs, and then be able to identify and simulate that patient's blood flow under these different potential treatment options under different scenarios. So different likely scenarios of how much they're going to work out, what their activity is going to be, some that are likely, some that are less likely, and really in an informed way bound that problem. And then we would be able to identify not only what is the best stent for that patient, for that specific patient, but we could provide personalized recommendations. Like if you actually were to exercise maybe 40 minutes a day, you would lower your specific risk of having in-stent restenosis by 70%. So have it be very tailored and personalized to that patient. It would allow us to improve our diagnosis, select potentially your optimal stent, and even go back and design better stents. If we shift to looking at years, we want to be able to identify how to make a patient less susceptible to long-term plaque buildup that leads to diseases like atherosclerosis. In the last 20 years, we've identified many single time point characteristics like wall shear stress, different pressure gradients, but we really haven't been able to always make them turn them into actionable guidance. If we had long-term views of what that patient's blood flow is going to be like, it would allow us not to only identify if they have entered a vulnerable state, but how long they've spent in that vulnerable state. And that would really help us establish different metrics for identifying and determining what are the mechanisms that are leading to the disease and how do we stop those from happening for those patients and how do we reduce it. Currently, there is no way to actually go from a single heartbeat to get a long-term blood flow map of a specific patient that's going to reflect their personal style. So our goal, one of the first steps for us in the cardiovascular modeling is to create these high precision longitudinal hemodynamic maps. So where are we at now and how are things going? As I mentioned, the current state of the art, you go into the clinic, you have a guide wire placed in. It's an invasive guide wire that's placed in your coronary artery. They will measure the pressure before your lesion, after the lesion, take the ratio, and if it's above or below 0.8, we'll determine if you're going to have a stent or not have a stent. It's been very successful in the last few years to create these digital twins. You create a digital model, a virtual representation of the coronary arteries, and that allows you to non-invasively measure in the digital twin what that pressure gradient is, and then they determine if they should or should not stent the patient. This is a huge step for using computational models in the clinic, as it allows us to move away from these invasive procedures and use non-invasive techniques. Methods like this are already being used in the clinic. There are FDA-approved tools that are being used to make these non-invasive twins and are being used to determine stent placement. In our work, we've created and completed a 200-patient multi-site trial between Boston and Brigham and Women's Hospital and Duke University to show that these kinds of models can actually mimic and recreate the same pressure gradients that you would get if you use the invasive guide wire. What I think is almost more interesting in some of the lessons that we've learned, again, the geometry is very critical and really is a key part of how we're getting this. There are options for using reduced order models, but then almost more interestingly, there's a role for complex flow metrics. So what we've found is that if you have metrics like vorticity, and if there's a higher rate of vorticity and likelihood of vortices occurring, if the patient was on the fence, if they're right on that borderline and maybe they weren't going to be given a stent because they're right above that 0.8 cutoff, if they have higher vorticity, they had a higher likelihood of adverse events. So there's an option for using these complex flow metrics and what we're getting out of these models to give more information than what you could get directly with the guide wire. And there's a lot of potential for using these digital twins to not only replace the invasive measurements, but really augment them and push it even further. And then, and if you want more details of this is the work that Cyrus will be presenting here tomorrow. One of our big steps that we're focused on is really trying to move beyond these single heartbeat metrics to how do we get to the months? How do we get to much longer time periods? We want to be able to drive the models from the wearable devices, and we want to be able to calculate long periods of time in a tractable manner. It's very similar to when you're looking at these weather models. It's not very helpful to have a simulation that says, the hurricane is going to hit and touch ground if the model takes 6 months to tell you and the hurricane touches ground tomorrow. It's not very helpful for me to run a simulation that takes 6 months to run to tell you you're going to have a heart attack tomorrow. We want to be able to do this in a tractable way and have it be useful, and that's what we're trying to develop. So what he's put together is a parallel in time approach that breaks the model down and allows you to calculate these simulations in a much shorter time frame. One of the big advantages here in previous literature, the highest number of heartbeats that had been simulated was only 30. And this is for a lot of reasons. It's not just that it's a computational challenge, it's that there's no reason to. When you didn't have any wearable data and you were just getting information from the patient just sitting in the doctor's office, there was really no need to go beyond a single heartbeat. But now that we have this information, we have that need and we need to push that further. So we've already completed an initial validation where we just shut down most of our cluster at Duke, and we just ran an explicit simulation to really validate. It took on the cluster to explicitly model about 750 heartbeats, several months of continuous use on our Duke cluster, and then using our new LHMF frameworks, the long longitudinal hemodynamic mapping framework, we were able to show that we can map and get exactly the same results that you would get from that explicit simulation, but do so in a fraction of the time, making it much more tractable with these parallel in time methods. It allows us to go even further. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing someone's shear stress and you're seeing it change over time, and we're watching it just for about 700,000 heartbeats, or how it's going to change over 7 days. The key part here is right now what we look at is, did you enter a vulnerable state? And by getting these kinds of metrics and this kind of data over time, driven from wearable information, we can actually assess how long were you in this vulnerable state. And we can start getting better, more robust pictures of what is happening for those patients. And by having these LHMs, they're actually statistically different than what you would have gotten from a single heartbeat, and gives a much more robust picture of that patient's physiological state, and hopefully will allow doctors to have more informed metrics to determine where are they likely going to have disease, what action should they be taking to change it. The goal is to get towards this vascular twin. By having a vascular twin that is driven by this wearable data, we are able to track the patients over time. We're able to track them over different activities. So we can see as they're running, as they're going through their daily, as they're reading their papers, as they're going through their daily activity, we can track and monitor them when they're in their home and in their daily lives. And not only that, but we can sample and look prospectively and sample the ensemble of hypothetical paths. So say, what if you were to get COVID and you go into quarantine again? What if you get sick? What if you go hiking in Denver? What if you go, whatever activity you're going to do, how do we actually identify and look at these prospectively? And I want to shift in and give another example, and I'm showing the video again just because I think this is an interesting side from the effect of being at supercomputing. When I showed this video back in 2010 at my George Michael talk, Jerry Lee, who at the time was at the NIH, now he's at USC, came to the talk and was like, it's great that you're doing cardiovascular disease and you're looking at this, but have you ever thought about cancer? And having that one conversation, as, like in the questions of my George Michael talk, really ended up leading to an entire avenue of like my first grant as an academic, as a professor, and the entire direction of part of our lab. So now, as you're watching this video, you can kind of imagine one of the things we're trying to do is just drop a cancer cell in the middle of all of those cells and try to see how is it interacting with the different red blood cells. And once a cancer cell moves off the primary tumor, how is it going to move through the bloodstream? What is it about that cancer cell that's causing it to metastasize to different locations? And what are the underlying mechanics causing its transit in different locations? So to get there, we now, if you're looking at questions that revolve around the cellular components, we need to model all of the different cells, and it puts an entirely new computational multi-scale burden on top of this. So we are using immersed boundary, we're using our finite element solver for the mechanics of the deformable red blood cells, and we're still using our fluid mechanical model that you saw before. In using these multi-scale challenges, the first step is just make sure you can actually model one cell and you get that one cell modeled correctly. So we did a lot of work focusing before you even get into the high performance computing side of it to model and actually get to mimic experimental data for red blood cells when you're having micropipette aspiration or other experiments of like specific cancer cells as they're moving through a microfluidic device to make sure we could actually tune the model to different cancer cells, and that's what you're seeing at the bottom. Once we were able to model a single cell accurately, the next step was thinking on the high performance computing side, how do we actually expand that and move up in the number of cells? We were able to push it to about over 500 million cells in an individual model. And then we increased what we were able to capture in these models. So Daniel's PhD thesis was really focused on adding in things like adhesion to the model. So when you're thinking about cancer cells, it really matters how that cancer cell is interacting with the endothelium. You need those ligand receptor pairings, but then you're adding a whole nother layer of complication to your computational model by having it go from your fluid domain down to these submicron, like nanometer scale and interactions in the adhesion domain, which you can kind of see here as we go through. You can see different cells moving through the geometry, interacting with the wall, and actually individually adhering and having adhesion occur between individual ligand receptors. So we've built up this incredibly robust model, and we're building towards what we need to get to the digital twin. And then we run into the fun problem of what you see here is about a 3.1 millimeter cube of red blood cells. And to model that, there's about 550 million red blood cells in that region. And that took all of Summit just to get that simulation completed. So if we want to get to even just this entire upper domain, even just moving to Frontier or Aurora when it's done, it's not going to be enough. Like there has to be some other way of how do we actually get to this. Brute force is not going to be the answer, and we need to have more model development. So that's where in the last year we've introduced what we call the adaptive physics refinement model. It's essentially a moving window and around the cancer cell of interest. So it really depends again on that question that you're interested in and what you're looking at. If what you care about is that the movement of a specific cell through the body, our hypothesis is if you have a cancer cell in the middle of that domain, and you look several centimeters away, the orientation of a red blood cell 2 centimeters away from the other from that cancer cell is not going to affect where it's moving, how it's changing, and doesn't need to be explicitly captured to get the real behavior of the cell. However, you do need to get the behavior of the fluid itself. You need the bulk fluid behavior, and you need to account for any changes from the geometry. So if vortices are occurring, if there are edge effects as it's moving through that curve, any of those effects on the fluid do need to be captured. So we've introduced essentially, it's similar to an adaptive mesh refinement, but using different physics-based models in that setting. As that window is moving through the geometry, inside the window you have all of the cellular interactions. So you have the cancer cell interacting with all of those red blood cells. Outside the window you have blood being modeled as a bulk fluid. So you have the much more viscous fluid on the outside. You then have the fun physics coupling problem of trying to have a more water-like plasma inside the fluid being coupled to the outside. And it allows it to move through the geometry. So you essentially have this box of cells moving through the broader geometry and allowing you to get cell-cell interaction, cell-cell behavior in a much more computationally light way. So in looking at this, we're able to get the large red blood cell geometry that is now captured in the box in the window, but then you're actually able to model the domain in the entire upper body, track the cellular behavior as it's moving through the other region, and actually get these cell-cell interactions on the order of the 400 millimeters showing here. We've done a lot of studies to really validate this. The one I wanted to show first is just kind of getting across why this is so useful. The domain you're seeing here seems really small, like it's just 18 millimeters across. Trying to be able to do an explicit fluid structure interaction model required 22 terabytes of memory just to get this model completed. If you're using this moving window framework, the APR framework, it only required 216 gigabytes of memory. So it allows us to do this in a much more tractable way. We then did an explicit model. So what you see at the top, we filled an entire expanded channel. We modeled the red blood cell movement there, and we compared it to the results that you're getting with that moving window. Some of the interesting things to note that you can kind of see in the second piece. The reason you really need to have that bulk fluid model that you're coupling is as you move through that expanded channel, you can kind of see the red as it's going through. If you were just modeling the fluid in that box, you wouldn't know that you're near an edge. You wouldn't get the change in velocity that's coming from that underlying geometry. So you need to have the coupled model that's in the bulk fluid, that's in full geometry, that's gonna feed in and tell the boundary conditions to the cellular window that's moving through. As we were able to do this, we could model it with the moving window and actually able to have recovered the same trajectory for that cancer cell that you see the movement that's you see that migration that's coming through based around having that expanded channel, and you're actually able to capture it with just having that moving window coupled to the larger model with significantly decreased memory costs, significantly decreased computational costs. We can go further in reducing this initially we were looking at what's the biggest box you can have, how do we actually have all of the red blood cells, and then we were trying to look into, you don't actually need to have the moving window domain around it to be as large as the entire Summit supercomputer. You can recover the behavior and only need so many cells away as the size of the cube. So we tried running a simulation where we had the cube fit on just one node in the cloud. And by cutting this computational cost down, we're able to get the cellular behavior as it's moving across that entire domain in only about 500 node hours. If you were going to do an explicit model, that would take up potentially all of Summit or a large amount of Summit to try to fill that entirely with red blood cells. And just for comparison, even if you were just running for 1 hour, remember that Summit has about 4,600 nodes. So getting all of this, the transit of that cell behavior, all the way across that coronary domain in only 500 node hours allows us to get these simulations, really allows us to get this to be much more computationally intense, or much less computationally intense, and something that other researchers could use, because not everyone is as lucky as everybody here that has access to the big DOE supercomputers, and we want to be able to introduce algorithms that are democratizing these kinds of models and allow other researchers to really start using them. By getting these models together, it's allowing us to start building digital twins not only of the patient and the personalized side of it, but also of microvascular printouts that you're seeing on the right, and digital twins of the devices. So we're working with a team at Berkeley where we're creating a digital twin of their mechanophenotyping device, and that is allowing us to extract parameters that they can't measure directly in their experiment, but by having a digital twin, they can get out quantities like the Young's modulus and other quantities that are hard to measure in a high throughput manner. So then, now that we've kind of built on these, we've pushed the temporal domain, we've pushed on the spatial domain, where are we and what's really next? So I wanted to highlight two major pieces at the end, especially being here at supercomputing. There are a lot of open computational challenges as we try to get to the idea of a virtual human and digital twin. We need help, and we're definitely open to collaborating with anyone, so if you're working in these spaces, please consider talking to us. But you have issues, like as we move to systems like Aurora, like Frontier, we are generating petabytes of data per time step. If you're trying to model, a week of time even, that's many, many, many time steps. It is not physically possible to output and store a petabyte of data for every single several hundred million time steps or even more than that, and then post hoc analyze everything. We are in a situation now where in situ analysis and situ visualization is really critical and important, and ways to figure out when do we really need to store the data, how do we handle storing the data. And as we've all seen, we have all these different systems coming out. We need to really consider our ability for portability and performance on different systems. On our end, we're getting system time, on AMD's GPUs, on the Intel GPUs, on NVIDIA. We need the code to be performant and be able to move across all these different types of GPUs easily. So we've been doing a lot of work looking into what are the best programming models we should be using, what's the role of Cocos versus OpenECC, and I'm sure everyone here has been having a lot of these discussions this week of how do you actually address all of these heterogeneous supercomputers, and how do we really prepare for that going forward? And it's really becoming even more critical today. We're working to develop machine learning surrogates, and how do we really tie in all of these advances on the AI side with these physics-based models? It's not just the data analysis side we want to be doing. We need these predictive models. We need the physics-based simulations, and how do we actually make use of all of these advances and tie it in? By building all of this, we are trying to get towards this idea of the virtual human, how the digital twin can really help advance our knowledge and really improve doctors' abilities to, again, we want to be able to diagnose disease easier. We want to improve our ability to track and monitor patients when they're not in the clinic, when they're at home. And we want to be able to improve the ability to treat the patients. We want options for virtual surgery. We want to be able to identify what is the best stent for you, what is the best treatment for you, and have this be tuned in. And we know that we're going to be able to bring in data not just from the circulatory system that I've been focusing on and that my lab really focuses on, to have a true digital twin that's going to be useful. And we can go back one slide again. But to have a true digital twin that's going to be useful, we really want to move towards and set a framework that people can use to bring in data from genetics, from immunology to neurology, and have these dynamically evolving predictive models. It is critical that we are getting data from that specific patient, that we personalize these models, that we make use of this continuous automatic data that we're able to get, and really have this tight feedback loop between these models and what we're trying to create. So with that, I'll acknowledge that this has been a vast amount of work from many different collaborators around that many are here at SC, and our team and a lot of the doctors and physicians that we've been working with. And I'll just end on the shameless plug of if you really like the work, we're always open for collaborators, and we are also always hiring. So please reach out, and I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you for an interesting talk. Any questions from the room? I think I see one. Nope. Okay. Repeat the question.
So the question is to talk a bit more about how we got the geometry and where the anatomy is coming from. So in our work, we use a lot of 2D angiograms where we can reconstruct the 3D geometry from angiography. We also work with CT scans, MRI scans. We use commercial software when we're working with CT, where we use Mimics from Materialize as our tool for segmentation. But pretty much anything where you have the 3D anatomy is critical for that side. We've started working on ways to get it from Doppler ultrasound, but there are many different options as long as you have the 3D anatomy.
Okay, question over here. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. So the question, in case anyone couldn't hear, the question is like, how are we looking to integrate machine learning into these models and tying in the machine learning with the physics-based simulations? And I think there's a ton of different options for us, and we've been kind of trying to figure out what the best way is. We've talked about different options, which I think we've seen a lot of talks here of just how do we identify the tight, surrogate models to get, anything that's the really computationally complex components. Can we offload that in a machine learning model? We're trying to figure out how to train. We're doing a lot of work looking at one state. So let's say you're looking at a resting state simulation, which may be less computationally intense. Can you, predict what's going to happen in a specific exercise state based on your resting state simulation? So how do we get enough data, even just within one patient, to be able to train and say and predict different physiological states without actually having to run through all of these different simulations? And we're looking at a lot of different options for combining, reduced order models with the 3D flow, and how do we connect there? And even just basic questions of, how do you use, looking at in situ machine learning training, and how do you actually access the data? There's a lot of challenges on all fronts, and we're interested in each of these.
Next question.
Okay, I hope this works, yeah. So you have also talked about the use of these systems in improving and personalized medicine. And I was wondering whether you also see a role in using the simulations in order to guide the current development of medical guidelines.
Oh, that's a really good question. I thought you were going to go into designing new drugs instead of guidelines, and that threw me off there. I think there is a huge role. You're seeing a lot of advances. Like the FDA is very interested in the role of in silico models, the role of computational tools for setting such guidelines, and you're seeing much more acceptance. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space, and there's people open and willing to talk about that as well, which is great.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, so it's very exciting research, but the privacy implications scare me a lot. Because us humans are certainly willing to give up a lot of our personal data to live longer, right? So,
right.
Is there any thoughts on how to do the right balance for that kind of thing?
It's definitely something that, it's critical and incredibly important. It's something where, aside from always trying to figure out what are the best, how do we store the data, how do you secure it, how do you ensure it on that side, that is a clear part of what we're trying to look at. And a lot of what we're doing at this stage, we do a lot of de-identifieds, we work with a lot of de-identified data in the development of the tools on that end. As we're going forward, we're working really closely we're at Duke, and we do a lot of work with the Duke Health System. We're working with them to figure out, with the wearable data, how do you make that so secure and ensure that it's only being used for, it's only being accessed, and only whatever you are allowing them to access. And there's a lot of work on the ethics and fairness of how we actually are using assigning on that data. I think it's something we're all thinking about and trying to create. It's been reassuring, and from a research standpoint, it's been frustrating, but it's really reassuring that it's really hard. For instance, getting Apple Watch data is incredibly hard because it is so secure, which is great from your data. Difficult when you're trying to access the data and build models, but it is there are a lot of constructs in place and a lot of work, and we are, when we need to have patient-specific data, it's something you have to consider, and we're trying to find ways of when you can have surrogates and de-identified data when you can as well, to kind of balance that out.
Thank you.
Good. Based on the timers I see here, we have at least one more question, so next one.
Hi, so my question was a little bit more about the quality of the data. So you were talking about wearables, and when those devices were approved, it wasn't necessarily approved for high quality data for medical purposes. It was meant to kind of track what you've been doing and kind of informal settings, lower risk.
Yes.
So how do you kind of coalesce that with the historical medical data that's been collected, and how do you use all of that and account for those uncertainties? And does that make your physics-based deterministic models way more complicated to run?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, especially, when you're working with wearable data, it's yeah, that you may not wear it for some periods, the battery runs out. What if your kid picks it up and is running around, you have to identify that it's, So we've been talking a lot about, so right now we're doing that first step of the pilot of is it even feasible to run a physics-based simulation from the wearable device? And that's where we're at today, right? It's not, we are gearing up for a clinical trial where we're gonna see if this is useful and try to sort out, how do we make this tenable, which devices, if you're doing it all off of an Apple Watch, where you have to charge every, all of those difficulties, we're trying to sort out, and we're at the early stages. But it is something, what we've been talking a lot about is trying to use secondary metrics that you're not using in the model to ensure and identify when has this gone off the rails of can we also predict blood pressure? And now that all the new wearables are coming out with blood pressure metrics, have that be well, the blood pressure is completely off. Either the patient really needs to go in and see the doctor anyway, or the toddler's wearing it and it's completely, so trying to figure out ways of really safeguarding and ensuring. And a lot of what we're trying to look at now, when we're trying to look at the longitudinal hemodynamic maps, we want to get the overall trends. So today's state of the art is we look at your wall shear stress over 1 heartbeat, and we say, is it above or below the 2 Pascal cutoff? So just getting to the point of well, you spent 20% of your time above the 2 Pascal cutoff. It's okay if you missed 10 heartbeats in there. Trying to understand where is that sensitivity and doing a lot of the sensitivity analysis of do we really need every single heartbeat? We've been doing a lot of work on how do we cluster it, not have to individually even model all of them. And so, but taking those questions into account of there are many places where the wearables, it's sparse data that's spotty, and yeah, you have to really take that into account.
Great. So we've just hit our time limit. Let's once again thank the speaker. And we have a certificate to present. Oh. Vasco has it.
I'll put my clicker down.